Welcome everyone. Thank you for coming back and being part of our community. It's very nice that we are receiving lots of comments. Our social media is very engaged at the moment, and we're receiving very nice comments from around the globe from the various communities that are watching us on live streaming. So this is rather nice to know that while we're here together in, the corporate, meaning corporal rather, not corporate, in the corporal sense, there are people with us in the spiritual sense through technology, which is lovely. So we now go to the next session. It's a panel presentation, and it's my honor to have Professor John Stoltz, who's a wonderful scientist and inspires us all at the university with his science. John will introduce the speakers. John?
Thanks, Jerry, and welcome to this next session of the Integrity of Creation Conference. First of all, I'm supposed to give a shout out to tweet us at Duke at Duke/IOC or hashtag 2016 Duke IOC. So again, I don't tweet, but I hear it's a fun thing to do. Anyway. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our first speaker for this session. Is a colleague of mine, Dr. Michael Blackhurst. He's the Research Development Manager at the University Center of Social and Urban Research at the University of Pittsburgh. He's been instrumental in organizing databases on water and getting a whole group of us together in the same room at the same time to talk about water issues in this region. He has degrees from Carnegie Mellon University in Civil and Environmental Engineering, and his research focuses on energy and water demand side management for building sector, regional climate change mitigation and adaptation, regional water resource planning, and environmental life cycle assessment. His work has been profiled in the New York Times and National Geographic, and today he's going to present on exploring the limits of science and engineering for environmental decision making. Dr. Blackhurst.
Thank you. Thank you so much. So this is a very unusual talk for me because it's an unusual audience, but a really fun opportunity for me. This truly is an exploration. So it will probably, for those of you who are in the science and engineering community, much of the talks like this have a very tightly coupled lineage, but this is a little bit more exploratory for me, a little bit more philosophical. It's not my area of expertise, but something I'm really interested in, and my interest is growing, and so I really appreciate the opportunity for you to share this with you today. I'll emphasize that I am going to be somewhat critical of the tools, at least the current tools of science and engineering, but I am an engineer. This is a professional engineer, and I am a scientist, so there's a fair amount of self-criticism being levied here as well, and I do have a lot of faith in science and engineering, but I do also have a lot of questions. And so I wanted to go over some background for why I'm giving this talk. I was looking at data describing electricity consumption in a few hundred homes in Austin, Texas. And we were just exploring the data. We didn't have any preconceived notions about what we were going to find. But looking at the data from different perspectives, we kept coming across this observation that homes with solar panels on their roofs we're using a little bit more electricity than homes without solar panels. And this is an unusual finding. You wouldn't expect that. And much of the literature and policy on solar PV assumes that all the electricity is produced on roofs goes to displace other forms of energy like natural gas or coal. And so we dug into this quite a bit, and it turns out that for this sample, and again this is just a few hundred homes, there was in fact an increase in consumption of around 20%. And that increase in consumption was equivalent to around 2 people living there, or 500 square feet of floor space, or 1 electric vehicle. So it was not insignificant. And it really was a bit troubling for me to think about such a promising technology that has really sort of a pure environmental plus. What's happening, what I suspect is happening, we didn't interview these homeowners, is that there's an increase in consumption following this technical change, where homeowners with PV feel justified in turning their lights on, or buying a new appliance, or changing the thermostat setting, right? And so this has kind of set me on a tailspin to think a lot about, what are we doing with these scientific gains and these technological gains, and further in-depth discovery of where are the limits of science and engineering. So I want to briefly talk about, much of this talk is going to be contrasting sort of basic science as a philosophical tool and what many scholars call either pseudoscience or post-normal science. So I want to set the stage for that a bit. This is the way that basic science works. There are kind of two modes of thinking. There's deduction. Let's see if I can get this to work. Yep, going back. I'm just going to not use this. There's deduction, which is on the right-hand side of this cycle, where you start with some theory. You know, you understand something about the scientific processes. There's some natural or physical theories that you understand, and there's some few remaining uncertainties, so you say, I'm going to try to address these with preparing a hypothesis and observe some data and then test that hypothesis. And then there's induction, which is more exploratory, what I just talked about with the homes. We had a bunch of data, we're looking for trends, we don't really have any sort of theory to think about, we're just being agnostic with respect to theory, and this is the way that basic science works. I think a lot of people get a little bit confused in this hypothesis testing piece, including myself at times, and so I want to talk a little bit about that and get some intuition for that. So here's just a bunch, this is made up data to try to make the case for what basic science does. Let's say I'm interested in exploring this relationship between floor space and electricity consumption. Again, these are made up data. And I look at this and there's no trends whatsoever. Right? But my intuition tells me that there should be something, there should be some trend. Bigger buildings have a higher volume, they might need more lighting, et cetera, et cetera. And on the right-hand side is a box plot. Box plot shows all the scatter that's in the data. So that would be what you'd see if you looked at electricity consumption per square foot or square meter or whatever. Tremendous amount of variation. But let's say I find new information about this. Okay, now I could start to see some trends because I see that homes in Texas, when I have that information, I'm starting to see a relationship there. And this little blue part over here, I've been able to explain a small portion of all that variation, right? And I find out more information. Maybe these are homes with solar panels. And I'm able to explain a little bit more of that variation here on the right-hand side. And so the process of basic science is taking randomness and trying to explain that variation. And the more you can explain, the more confident you are in your results. And that's all that happens in hypothesis testing. And so over long periods of time, this interplay between deduction and induction has accumulated scientific understanding. So this schematic shows in these light gray bars some knowledge that we've built, right? And we're able to move forward in our understanding of the way the Earth works or the way technologies work. And then we get to a point where we don't quite understand things and there's a little gray area there. And we work through that with data and hypothesis testing. And we have some more knowledge and we continue to accumulate that. And this could be two different types of science, biology and chemistry, et cetera, et cetera. And then when you're at the frontier of knowledge, there's a lot more of uncertainty. We're still looking at data. We have some hypotheses, but we're not quite sure what's happening. And again, this is the way that basic science is working. Now, engineering, it operationalizes the scientific knowledge, right? So a great example is we better understand, as we gain an understanding of the bacterial theory of disease, we're able to understand where bacteria go in the ecosystems, and we could treat our water. We can then design water treatment plants and wastewater treatment plants. Right? So you can find hundreds of examples where the scientific insight that we accumulate helps us design technologies to take advantage of that science. And this mode of decision making has really worked well and produced really wondrous technologies for us. Again, the bacterial theory of disease helped us make sanitation improvements. The discovery of acid rain, how sulfur dioxide and nitrous oxides move in the atmosphere. We were able to develop innovations in scrubbing emissions so that they aren't emitted into the atmosphere. Some work in physics and electron theory has given rise to transistors and then eventually the computer, right, and all the things that we're using today in our phones. But my assertion here, and this is where I don't have I can't use the tools of science to assert this is, well, here's some other anecdotes that describe, that underscore that this is sort of the momentum of the interplay between science and engineering, right? The National Science Foundation, which is our premier sponsor of scientific research, their environmental sustainability program really emphasizes this using science for technological gains, right? That's the whole premise of the entire program. And you can find similar language if you read the entire description of this program. So my assertion here is that a lot of the salient issues that we have with science, it's not just working as well. And it doesn't mean that it can't work. It just means we need a new dialogue and we need new tools. So let's explore that a little bit more. Here's some characteristics. So here's this paradigm that I described schematically here. what are some things about the environment that may not fit here? The environment has tendencies of irreversibility, right? If we lose the global ice sheets, they're probably gone, right? There's issues of complexity, right, that don't fit in the testing of hypotheses, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. And the environment demonstrates these discontinuities. Again, the global ice sheet is a good one. But what happens if ocean acidification completely erodes our coral reefs? Right? We don't have data that describe that system, and so it becomes untestable or unknowable. Another challenge here is there are occasional shifts in our fundamental understanding of science. Right? So in around 1900, the scientific understanding of sanitation was that if we could get waste to rivers, we just get them to rivers, the waste will be cleaned up. Running water purifies itself, right? And we invested in a technology to handle that, which is combined sewers. And so now, as a region, if those of you are familiar with our water quality problems, we're really struggling to fix that issue, right? We deployed a technology that has lasted 100 years and is very difficult to fix based upon some flawed understanding. And the question I guess I have to some degree is, are we now omniscient that we can continue to make these investments? A lot of our investment in shale gas was on the backs of the premise that shale gas, when burned, emits about half the carbon dioxide. But we now understand that there's a whole lot of leakage of methane in the infrastructure system, and we're really getting about a 10% gain, 10 to 15% gain there. And so again, I'm trying to, well, let me move on and it'll become clear why I'm using these anecdotes. So another challenge that I struggle with here is many of our issues are not testable, right? I often think about how many Earths do we need to prove this assertion of man-made climate change. We don't have that luxury from an empirical standpoint. We don't have 3,000 Earths with all the variability we might need to understand, is man-made climate change one of the factors contributing to our climate issues. This issue of being able to keep pace with empirically with our empirical needs. Right? Ocean acidification is a good example. Could we possibly instrument that entire system, collect that information, and process it at the pace at which it's changing so that we can intervene? And that's a big challenge we have here. Now, how does irreversibility limit empiricism? What if we lose key populations of species, right, that are key in the ecosystem services? We're not going to measure the ecosystems under the premise that those species are gone, right? So we're really unable to observe that. And then finally, I just want to walk through this as a sort of final limit. The scale of what we're attempting to engineer here is quite tremendous. This is a modification from a paper, or a book, a really excellent book called Sustainability Without All the Hot Air by David McKay. And he estimates the amount of energy per capita that's used in the UK here on the left-hand side. And then he says, well, if we could exhaust all of our renewable energy sources, all of them, the most aggressive the thermodynamic limit of what we could get would be less than what we're currently consuming. And then if he applies things like, cost practicalities, space practicalities, et cetera, they're a fraction of what they actually use, right? And so when we talk about sustainability, we can't fight the reality that there are thermodynamic limits to what we can do. And if you read the literature in sustainability, you find that there's a tendency to want to ignore that reality. So then what are we doing? What's different? There's still a lot of important science and engineering to be done, but can it be done under this old premise? And so I want to contrast quickly what we call basic science with what people call post-normal science. Right? And so this is the classic presentation of it. It's been a paradigm for maybe about 15 years, and post-normal science is a space where the uncertainties are much greater than what can be handled through basic science. And climate change is a great example. The decision stakes are really significant. If we get something wrong, right, the consequences are going to be more significant than getting it wrong at a lab scale test, if you will. And so what we're working here is what we're used to working with is in this schematic that shows the arrows, this high confidence amount of information. Right? We have this really high confidence information. The parallel would be if you went to the doctor, and every time you went to the doctor and you were sick, you got better. And then the doctor says all of a sudden, doesn't share this with you, but they give you a recommendation that isn't founded with the same amount of confidence, right? And so that's kind of, I think what's happening now is we're trying to use what post-normal scientists will call the best available information, but it lacks the pedigree of confidence that we're used to. So let's just contrast these with a little bit more detail. The purpose of basic science is simply to create knowledge. Right? There's no bias in the underlying sort of pure philosophy of science, but in post-normal science, we're just trying to make a decision. And so you start from a very different standpoint. The resources we have available to us in basic science are really great representative data. We create data that we need to address the questions of interest. In post-normal science, we're really looking at the best available information, right? And that's a totally different resource. The methods we use in basic science are hypothesis tests and observations, so we can get a tremendous amount of confidence out of basic science. But in post-normal science, we're sampling from this best available information. We're using simulation that is incomplete representation of the world. Machine learning is a ever-growing method. And the standards that we use in basic science create a tremendous amount of confidence, falsifiability, but again, in post-normal science, it's limited by the best available information we have to us. So I just wanted to contrast the classical view of post-normal science with a more skeptical view. The other side of the coin of system uncertainties is risk, right? So we'll be taking more risks by using this type of approach, and the consequences will actually be of getting it wrong are actually quite significant. And as opposed to thinking about post-normal science as using the best available information, perhaps we could use the terms incomplete information. And you could see evidence of this in the literature and in the popular press, and I'll share some popular press article titles with you in a second, but climate scientists struggle to communicate their confidence under the premise of post-normal science. We use this statistic 97% of scientists endorse as opposed to the confidence level is 97%. It's a totally different underlying type of information that we're trying to force fit into our old manner of thinking and communicating our scientific confidence. And I think that people have good intuition to know that an endorsement by individuals is very different than an observation and a confidence test. And so, it was great to hear some of the previous talks. A lot of the language is foreign to me, but I'm starting to think of science more as a faith, where either nature is knowable and testable, and you have faith in the scientific method to get us there, or it's not all knowable and it's not all testable, and we have faith in what we can know and can test that is going to be adequate to inform our decisions. So here's just a few articles that I thought were interesting. They're very recent, that indicate that there's some growing skepticism of how science can, in fact, inform these really uncertain and high-stakes decisions. So what are some risks of over-reliance on science and engineering? Well, technological subsistence is one, where in the past, technologies have really brought us a tremendous amount of wonderful improvements. But if we fully exhaust all the natural capacity through technological gains, we're going to be living in a world where subsistence is really the mode of technological innovation and use, as opposed to creating these historical wonderful gains. This issue of equity continues to come up. Who has access to these technologies? Who are on the receiving ends of unintended consequences of innovation? Irreversibility is a concern that I have, I mentioned already, and there's a lot of work in the space of catastrophe where scholars study older civilizations that were isolated environmentally and have consistently found that they essentially consume themselves into non-existence. And again, this is very doomsday and negative. I still have a lot of faith in science, but I think some corrective action can be helpful. So how can we, one way that I try to teach this and to think about this is resolving the gains that we get from science and engineering, right? So science and engineering can provide us with a tremendous amount of gain, right? That gain can be a monetary gain, an environmental gain, an information gain, but how does it resolve itself is really the issue. And I'll come back to the example I first showed with homes with solar PV. In that case, this particular group of people resolved that technological gain of solar panels by increasing consumption, right? And if that's the mode in which we're going to use our environmental technologies, then the efficacy of them is going to be quite limited. So where do we go from here? I try to assert that we just need to raise the standard of proof we need for social investments in technology and innovation, and we need new ways to communicate the difference between post-normal science and basic science. I would really like to see a cultural shift towards acknowledging these limits as opposed to embracing overconfidence in science and engineering, and be more careful and take a precautionary approach. Again, better differentiating between basic and post-normal science would be helpful in gaining a popular understanding of what that difference means. And you know, scientists and engineers need to do a better job of welcoming information that doesn't fit into a hypothesis test, like unintended consequences, like some of the examples I gave today. It may be inconvenient, but it's still information, and information is in fact the currency of science and engineering. That's all I have. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. It was very interesting, and I've already got a bunch of notes that we'll have a very encouraging discussion. Our next speaker is Dr. Brady Porter. He's a colleague of mine here at Duquesne University, an associate professor, has been part of the faculty since 2003. He holds degrees from Ohio Wesleyan and Ohio State. And he specializes in the genetics of endangered fish species and large birds. Fortunately, the large birds are not housed at Duquesne, but he goes out into the environment with his students. He's an avid angler, hosting fishing parties at his home that abuts Pine Creek. It's pretty amazing and a lot of fun. And he's extremely knowledgeable about our local waters and their inhabitants. His presentation today is Navigating the Anthropocene with Jack Sparrow's Compass. Dr. Porter.
Thank you, and I really appreciate the opportunity to talk here, and I've enjoyed the diversity of talks that have occurred. I felt maybe my place here might be to show the severity of what we have done to the earth from a standpoint of a very non-worldly view, just what's happening around here in Pittsburgh and in Pennsylvania as examples, and hoping you can extend these types of ideas to wherever you are and understand that it's a lot more diverse than what I can present in 15 minutes here. So from a very early age, I've been fascinated with organisms and nature. I remember going out, looking at field guides, and then trying to go out in my local parks and areas and backyard, and just trying to find some of these organisms, and then fascinated with the interactions that they have with each other and with the environment, where they live and how they're habitat specialists, what organisms they rely on for food, and how they become food themselves, and even how after they die they return to the nutrients, return back to the system. And I had appreciation of that from a very early age by being out and looking at nature. And also at an early age I was exposed to a book with some of Charlie Harper's great symbolic types of artwork. And although he simplifies nature into these basic geometric shapes, he still captures the amazing amount of stories that happen all the time around us as animals live their life in their environment and interact with one another. And he truly is an advocate of, or was an advocate of biodiversity. And biodiversity, of course, is this big buzzword. It's been used, it's a pretty simplistic word if you want to dissect it. The living things, and basically how many and different types, and how they're spread about with numbers of individuals and numbers of different types. But really, it's quite complex at a number of different levels. So you can look at biodiversity at an ecosystem level. You can say how many different ecosystems are within this region, and that's a certain amount of richness all by itself. And with that, then the species that specialize in those various ecosystems, how many different species, and how is it dominated or not dominated by certain individuals. And then biodiversity can be looked at even at the genetic level. Within a species, how much genetic diversity is there between individuals. And all of these are important to the way our Earth is structured. if you consider a species like the beaver here, and you wanted to look at the genetic diversity, basically its ability to adapt to its environment as a species depends on the partitioning of genetic diversity among individuals. This is its evolutionary potential. When its environment changes, some individuals will have the appropriate genes for those change, survive, and carry on that lineage and that adaptation. So at the genetic level, the species or the populations and species are dependent on there, and then at the species level, of course, they're very dependent on the ecosystems that support them and interact with each other in very complex ways. We know that ecosystems that have a diverse amount of species are more resistant and more resilient to changes because of their biodiversity that's in. And so I'll move from that and the importance of biodiversity to talk about some of the human impacted losses of biodiversity, and one of its champions, E.O. Wilson, the famous sociobiologist who has discovered lots about ants and sociality, but also has given us things like the BioBlitz, the 24-hour survey of organisms that first took part in Central Park in New York, a 24-hour investigation of everything that's living there by scientists, but also encouraging the public to understand what's in their own backyards and why that's important. And so he's been a pioneer in that, and then these ethical values of biodiversity. And he came up with a very easy way to remember the losses of biodiversity, which he terms in this acronym HIPPO. So HIPPO, the H in HIPPO stands for habitat destruction, habitat fragmentation, habitat modification. The I for the introduction of exotic species. The P for pollution or pesticides or even global warming as a form of thermal pollution. It goes into this category. The second P is population size, and although you could argue it could be the waning population sizes of certain organisms, what he really means is the population size of humans and their exponential growth. And finally, O for overharvesting, overexploitation, overfishing, overhunting, these types of things. So again, I'm going to apologize for, in part, for my non-worldly own issues, and that I focus around very regionally, but I am going to encourage you to think about how each of these might influence or how some of the issues apply to your own regions. And I'll start with this habitat modification and introduce one more concept, the concept of an ecosystem engineer. And I'm going to use here the example of the beaver and its ability to turn a free-running stream into and modify its habitat around it by building a dam into an ideal environment for itself. And so some of these, all organisms modify their environment around them as part of how they live, but some have a major influence on the changing of the habitat in such a way that it totally dictates what other organisms can live there. And certainly the beaver does this by damming up the stream and encouraging wildlife and fishes and insects and so forth that like more of a reservoir or a standing water situation compared to a moving water situation. But really the beaver, which was one of the probably main examples of an ecosystem engineer naturally, pales in comparison to what humans can do, the ultimate ecosystem engineer, if you will. You know, these locks and dams that we see on our great rivers here at the beginning of the entire Mississippi and Ohio system are taking what was a flowing stream and turning it into a series of interconnected reservoirs and highly modifying the habitat and the types of organisms that can live there and fragmenting the populations that are unable to move across these dams. Habitat destruction is also part of this H, and so here's a Here's a example of a Pennsylvania woodlot. It has already undergone a century of logging. It has already undergone a history of coal extraction, and it's recovered from those things, and there's a woodlot once more, and now it has a new wave of habitat destruction to put in a Marcellus well pad and make a little small commercialization of extraction of natural gas. So although these might not seem very big, 3 to 5 acres per well pad, and then maybe another couple acres for these ponds that are the water that they need for these, and sometimes this could either be the fresh water or the recycled brine water that's been sent down there. This is now a fragmentation back in the woodlot that's already been assaulted and general land multiple times by industrial things. And so on a small scale this is happening, but then you need to be able to move these products of natural gas from place to place. And once again, that's through pipelines and fragmentation of our woodlots. And here's one pipeline going in right through woods, interconnecting. And the cumulative amount of this type of industrialization is just massive. So here's a Pennsylvania example, and every little light spot you see here is a well pad, and the little connections between them are the roads or the pipelines. And sooner or later, you don't have much woodlot left, no deep internal woodlot, and all along the edges of this are modified habitat that are not deep woods. And collectively, this causes a major concern for habitat fragmentation and habitat destruction. And unfortunately, this isn't enough. Even though we are developing, and I wish I had one other slide in here I missed, which is how many of these different sites across this swath of Marcellus shale have been occurring over the last decade. But there's the need to still push this to our few refugias, our collective parks, state forests, and these types of things. It's not enough to just do this on private land. There's a push to do it into these state parks and public parks and all this thing. This is for the public to enjoy, and it's being utilized for industrial purposes that don't necessarily benefit all. And in part, this is some of the legacy peculiar to Pennsylvania, the Commonwealth, of detaching the surface rights from the mineral rights. So although this is a state forest and they own the surface, the state owns the surface rights, they didn't own, in all cases, the mineral rights underneath there. And there's provisions to put a gas extraction pad on top of here on the surface, impact the surface in order to get to the mineral, the gas underneath. And so destruction of the few places that we should be holding sacred are happening as well, and that's not under any of our control. Moving on to introduction of exotic species, the iron hippo, and on the left here you might think that those are, I don't know, giant trees out in the redwood forests of California, but no, this is from North Carolina, and it was the indicative tree throughout the Appalachians, the American chestnut. And this was the main climax community tree found throughout the Appalachians, and it was completely destroyed. But it was, in addition to the habitat that it was providing, the amounts of nuts, the massed amounts of nuts that fell to the ground, feeding bears, squirrels, deer, so forth, would be several feet deep at times in the fall. And just think of all that resource. And these were all wiped away by the introduction through globalization of needing wood products and these types of things. We brought accidentally in the chestnut blight, and this killed off all the American chestnuts and is still around after that major destruction. There's chestnuts that try to grow up. They get to about 20 years. They start getting little cracks in their bark, and they get wiped out by the chestnut blight. And so this is just an example of globalization and how you can introduce, intentionally or unintentionally, invasive species that then have a major impact on our native species. And then there's pollution, the first P in hippo. And I don't know if you can read this sign, but basically these are all around Pittsburgh, and as in many older cities where the solution was to use these combined sewer overflows, CSOs. And basically it's saying that during times of rain or snow or melt-off, anytime we get a lot, probably even after today's rains, that they're going to dump direct sewage into the stream. Here's one of these lovely outfalls on Jack's Run. This is, you can't get a good perspective of scale. I wanted my graduate student to stand next to it. They kind of refused. This is about a 6-foot tall tube that opens up and just spews raw sewage into Jack's Run, and that goes right into the Ohio River, just downstream from Pittsburgh here. And you might think there's just a few of these sort of things around. Every one of these orange dots here in this greater Pittsburgh map, and this is the Allegheny coming down here, and the Monongahela and meeting with the Ohio. All of those are combined sewer outfalls that are impacting and going directly into the river. And a secondary thing that they show on here is the waters that are safe for consumption of fish. It doesn't have to do with this raw sewage going in there, although the sewage also has runoff of the roads and things and does bring in some other impurities. But in general, the fish in this area are not suitable for consumption, and as indicated by the yellow, which is pretty much everything on this map in the Pittsburgh area, it does not meet the consumption guidelines for fish. So literally, we are living in and with our own waste at this point, even in cities that have been addressing these types of problems for a long time. As a population biologist, and you kind of go back to the theory of understanding how a population increases over time, and it starts out at a very low rate and it grows exponentially, and then eventually, and this is kind of the type of growth that's happening uninhibited by the number of individuals that are there. Sooner or later, the number of individuals start running out of resources, start running out of places to live, start running out of food and these types of things, and they inhibit their own growth. So we have density-dependent growth that slows the growth rate, still positive, until it starts to approach zero. And notice that's, even once it's zero, then it'll stabilize out, and that's the maximum number of individuals that population can sustain, or that habitat can sustain over time. We call that the carrying capacity. And where are we in this carrying capacity, or how close are we to that right now? You can see this long lifetime over going all the way back to the old Stone Age. For a very long time, human population has been very low. One of the major events that we might think of that impacted human, the dreaded Black Plague in the Middle Ages, is this tiny little dimple down here, hardly impacted in the grand scheme of things humans at all. They survived through that and now are in this exponential growth phase that continues on, and maybe you can just start seeing at the very, very top that might be slowing a tiny bit due to density-dependent factors. And if we blow up that area here, so it gives you an idea of in our histories of time that we can experience in our generation, gives you an idea of the trajectory of human population size. I was born in 1968, and so if you look on this graph, it was about at a time when there were 3.5 billion people on Earth, okay? In my lifetime, the population is now 7.5 billion. It has doubled in its population size in my lifetime. And on its current trajectory, at the current fertility rate, if nothing has changed, by 2050, if I live long enough, I might see it triple in my lifespan. That is just unbelievable. If other things change, I know humans are not your typical animal, and so education of females and these types of things about consequences of this can curtail the population size, and maybe we can settle out to somewhere close to 8 billion people on Earth if things change. If they don't, maybe it's going to be more towards 11 billion. If we think we have density dependent problems now with resources and with wars over resources, the main picture looks like it's just going to get worse. Over exploitation, I'll use the passenger pigeon, a classic example. When Audubon and Alexander Wilson were describing these flocks that would fly over Pennsylvania, they would be like great rivers that could block out the sun for days. The passenger pigeon was the most abundant bird on Earth with population sizes in the billions. How could humans ever possibly wipe these out? But we did. We hunted them to extinction. We shot the last 2 birds all the way back. You got down to 2 birds in the wild that we knew of. The last one was shot in Wisconsin and then in Ohio. And then the last living bird was put in the Cincinnati Zoo, Martha. She died in 1914. And with that, the extinction of the most abundant bird on Earth. And I think this shows us that we can't be this overconfident that our actions can make major changes and that the consequences of those changes will never get the passenger pigeon back. I know there's people that think we can genetically engineer things and bring them back. Where are they going to live? Where's their habitat now? It's not there. The starlings took over the introduced starlings took over their niches. Even if we could bring them back, what's the point? They're going to go be in a zoo and we can look at them like we did Martha, the last one. And so with all these types of changes, I'm going to welcome us all to the Anthropocene. And whether we believe it as geologists, whether geologists believe this or not, this is a useful concept to look at. We are in this kind of basically new epoch of geological history. And I think even the geologists are going to have to agree if we look at their own criteria of what makes a epoch in geological history. Do we have some sort of mass extinction event that marks this? Yes, we are in the 6th mass extinction of the Earth. And the extinction rates are anywhere between 100 and 1,000 times the background rate, and they're all caused by us. Do we have major land change uses? Absolutely. From agricultural and then industrial revolution, we've changed our land in major ways, and we've perturbed the global biogeochemical cycles of the carbon cycle by burning fossil fuels, the nitrogen and the phosphate cycle by fertilizing, and the water cycle. We're impacting all of these things, major changes at a global scale on these biogeochemical cycles. Are we leaving some sort of stratigraphic or biostratigraphic signature? Is there a signature fossil that we can use for the Anthropocene? In addition to all these humans that are buried, and some of them might turn into fossils, what about the bones of the 60 billion domestic chickens that we eat per year as a global human society? That should leave a nice layer of fossils. How about the stratigraphic signature, some sort of non-biological thing that might be left on the Earth to show us that the Anthropocene was real? How about these microplastics that are found globally throughout all our soils? How about, even bigger, the radioactive signature from testing of radioactive fallout that can be found as a layer throughout the Earth? Yes, we've had profound impacts, and I think the Anthropocene is a very good word to capture our impacts on the Earth. I got to switch gears because this is depressing. I agree. And so I'm going to use a little anecdote here and bring me back to my graduate work. I worked on the systematics of snub-nosed darters throughout the southeastern U.S. And here's one of these beautiful snub-nosed darters, the vermilion darter, Ethiostoma chermaki, the brilliant male, and the more cryptic females. And I was doing studies to understand the evolutionary relationships of these groups. And I was out with a field crew of 2 or 3 other graduate students, and just north of Birmingham, Alabama, where this fish lives in a 7-mile-long stretch of a 10-mile-long stream, Turkey Creek. And that's its worldly distribution. That's the entire place where this fish lives. And I'm discussing with my crew. We're talking about the cool things we saw during the day. We think we saw these males lekking in one part of the stream and drawing females to it, and we're having a great discussion. And this guy and we're in Shoney's, of course, great southern restaurant, and this guy next to us is sitting there with his wife, and he's like, and there's a big conflict, understand, this is in a suburb of Birmingham, and as it's pressing up to this stream in population, and it's all over the press that you're going to have to not develop this area as much as you'd like to because it has this endangered species in it. And at the time it wasn't even claimed as endangered, but we realized it was rare. And so this is hitting the papers, and it's getting the pushback from the public. And so this guy bends over on the table next to us and says, "You aren't some of them scientists that are trying to looking at that little fish, are you?" And I was like, "Oh boy." Well, yeah, we are. And he's like, "Well, I just don't think it's right to tell us what we can and can't do with our land because of that little stinking fish. What good is it anyway?" And I thought about for a long time, for a few seconds at least, in my mind it's racing. Here I am, a little smart aleck college student, 25. Am I going to try to explain the intricacies of if you cut down the riparian zone, it's going to heat up the water, it's going to send in the silt, it's going to suffocate the eggs, and you're going to kill this as a species. It has nowhere else in the world to live. That's not going to impress this guy. I could just tell already. So I tried an experiment. I said, "Are you a religious man?" "I'm in the Bible Belt. It's a pretty good chance, right?" Well, he responds, "Yes, I am." And I was like, "Well, it seems to me that the Bible teaches that we should be good stewards of the earth. And destroying every last individual of one of his creations just so you can live 100 meters closer to the stream is not being a good steward of the earth." And that seemed to shut him up. And I was able to eat the rest of the meal, and I was thinking, wow, this might have something. You know, this might actually be a way that people can understand that that might serve the purpose of also protecting our earth. We got to do this at a time when there's basically a nature deficit disorder brought to our attention by Richard Love in his award-winning book from 2005, The Last Child in the Woods. But this was supposed to be this very impactful book, and yet we see scenes like this all the time. Here's a person right out in nature, and a young girl, and instead of enjoying the nature and interacting with it, they're on their computer and they have their headphones, and they're totally isolating themselves from nature. I think many people these days are too disconnected to nature to even understand what their impacts are and what they can be. And so this brings me to the rest of the title of this talk, the Jack Sparrow's Compass. And I apologize for anyone that hasn't seen the Pirates of the Caribbean. I am kind of trying to appeal to some of the younger people that may have. But Jack Sparrow's Compass is a compass not like a normal compass that points to north. It's not a moral compass that directs him to anything particularly moral. It points to whatever he wants at the moment. And so sometimes it spins around and it points to the rum bottle he has in his right hand, and he takes a drink, and then it'll spin around and point to a treasure somewhere else off in the Caribbean, and he goes marching off to that and doesn't think about the consequence of acquiring that resource. He just does it. Okay? And so I think if we're going to make this huge cultural revolution, we have to think about what's happening. These capital vices of hubris, and I mean in the sense of pride to the point that we're blinded to the consequences of the actions, that we're entitled to these resources as a person or as a company, and these types of things. We need to be replacing these types of things with more humility. The greed, obviously, is a major part here that needs to be replaced with charity. The gluttony of killing every last pigeon or fishing the bluefin tuna back down to the last individuals with temperance. And sloth, basically, I don't even care about living in this living environment around me anymore, and I'm not going to do anything about it with extreme diligence. So with that, thank you.
I was struck by the illustration of the solar panels versus the use of energy. I think of California and their deployment of solar. California, as some of you know who've been there or spent time there, has had an enormous deployment of solar compared to what we have in the rest of the U.S. And yet their total energy consumption is about half of what ours is. And so there are other factors at play here. And I'm just curious, I have solar panels on my home. I've also installed LEDs throughout the entire house. I've put in a new, very energy efficient furnace. I'm surprised by that statistic, and I'd be interested in the citation on that.
Sure, I can point you to the study. But I think, can you hear me? I'll just talk really loudly. Is that better? Oh, I can go up here. So I'm happy to share with you the PhD dissertation that came from. But I think underlying much of this is, so California has also made tremendous investments in efficiency, energy efficiency, and so the coupling of efficiency with renewables can certainly improve the overall performance of the technologies, but we just heard a lot about hubris, and I think that if you're thinking about whether or not individuals correlate their environmental ethos when they make technology choices and uses of those technologies, or they compensate, that sort of underscores much of what I spend a lot of time thinking about. So if I live in a net zero energy home, and do I buy an SUV, or do I live further from my place of work, or do I correlate those choices at environmental ethos and say I'm going to do all these things on the premise of environmental gain? That's sort of the way that I navigate that. And certainly things like policy, California's been very aggressive with respect to creating the right incentive structure for those technologies, can influence that. And then another anecdote is that we need a lot more data to understand how these technologies are working. I try very hard to build the kind of data that we need, data on individual installations, data that couples the technology change with occupants and occupant behaviors and perceptions, but it's a very difficult ask from an investment standpoint. So the more data we can have, the more we can understand where the technologies are and are not working, where they're working in combination with individual person-level factors or other technologies, and where they're not.
So both of you in different ways talked about how scientists need to be better at communicating to audiences that are not scientists, both from just a story in a diner to talking about how we need to get a different way of presenting it. So do you have any ideas of how we do that for the next generation? How do we train our students from the undergraduates to graduates to be able to be good scientists, but also good communicators outside of the sphere of just talking to other scientists?
Actually, I was just talking with Dr. Dan Scheid about this beforehand. I think that we have a tendency to want to, science works because people are transparent and allow themselves to be criticized. I mean, that's the whole premise of basic science. So we have a tendency, I do this too, I probably did it today, where we want to over-communicate so that you know everything, right? And so you can be critical and we can collectively advance scientific knowledge. But the premise of many dialogue is not necessarily to be critical and advance scientific knowledge, it's just to communicate what you know. And so differentiating between the culture and history and legacy of communicating science in this ultra-transparent mode and getting everything out there versus boiling it down to one or two key messages. In the format of slides, I'm trying to be more disciplined about one key message per slide, right? So I think that's a helpful distinction to make, and to start training people to think not about communicating every detail, but choosing one or two key messages and working around that.
And I'd like to follow up on that. I think it also has to do with basic education, and we have to do a better job at younger ages of engaging students in experiential learning and being able to relate the science behind, as well as recognizing those scientists that are especially good at communicating. Because the story goes that Carl Sagan, those of you of my age remember growing up with Cosmos, and he never got into the National Academy as a scientist, but as a science educator. and got the highest, highest medal achievable for a scientist in this country. But he was lambasted because, oh, you're good at communicating, but you're not doing basic science. And yet, if you look at his science, it was amazing, and he made some amazing discoveries. So that's one of the key things, too, is just to make sure that we have more science educators.
Yeah, and while we're getting the microphone over there, I'll just mention one other thing on this, and that I believe that environmental science is a very integrative type of science, and it's probably one that needs to expand more, including the social aspects and the economic aspects and the biological aspects of examining things. It's much more integrative than biology has become in itself, or chemistry has become in itself, and these types of things. So I think that field has a promise for pushing a greater understanding.
I thank you for your presentations today. I was just curious to ask, it's often a struggle in my position because climate change is such a long-term and global issue, to kind of scale it down and explain it to people that aren't familiar with it in a way that they can relate to, that affects them in their present time, and to kind of take a larger issue and make it much more easier to understand. So my question is, in your experience, how have you gone and explained to people climate change in a way that they can not only feel impacted by, but also in a way that they feel like they can actually do something about it?
Well, even though I didn't give a presentation here, that's one of the things that I've been trying to do with, say, in the environmental biology class that I teach, and also after I leave here at lunch, I'm going to teach a class in the business school. And again, relating exactly, and it was interesting when I gave the presentation on climate change to the business students, they wanted to know ammunition. How do I talk to a company and tell them this is really, really important? And I think it comes down to just a couple of salient sound bites, including that this carbon dioxide that's warming things up is anthropogenic. It's absolutely clear, okay? But again, it's also overwhelming when you realize how difficult the situation is. But you also, I think, go beyond that and talk about the solutions. You know, because we have to break the carbon cycle, if you will. So it's a combination of all three.
So I appreciate that quite a bit, and I struggle in the same way. I think that I try to stick with differentiate between what is relatively accepted and what is still somewhat uncertain. We understand that we're emitting carbon at a rate that we haven't observed in recent history, and that's pretty well established. So that's something that we can all have confidence in. We understand the greenhouse effect, right? So that more carbon in the atmosphere means that there'll be more warming, and that's well established. Where there is debate is how much of it is natural and how much is man-made, and we just have to concede that there's going to be more uncertainty there. And as opposed to that uncertainty creating a vacuum for people to either be confused or to to attack the knowns, right? So we really try to establish what the knowns are and then focus on just that one piece that's unknown. And the reality is we have to concede that there's a little more uncertainty there, and we're not going to have the kind of confidence that we'd like. And so that's where these cultural issues come in, and the hubris comes in, and focusing on solutions is a great way to orient people where we can in fact invest in other modes of energy production and still maintain a decent quality of life without encumbering all the knowns with this one piece of information that's unknown, which again is that how much is man-made and how much is natural. So that's how I try to navigate that. Is just focus on that one thing and then focus on solutions after that.
So I spent, actually I'm going to start with, I love that story about you, Brady, talking about the fish with your colleague at luncheon and everything. And I've spent most of my career thinking about how to get people to care about these kinds of things, right? And that's one good way. So it's kind of a two-part question. One, have you collectively, all the panelists thought about what are the other ways we really get people to care. All the data and everything, if you don't already care, you don't care. The data doesn't mean anything, right? You have to find a way to care. And then second, being here at a Catholic university for this presentation, it always seems to me that there's way more opportunity for the clergy, the religious, to actually articulate this and give people a reason to care from their vantage point, right? They speak to lots of people, whether one-on-one or from a pulpit. Do you think there is a place for more of this messaging to come from the religious community to actually influence how people care?
I'll try it, yeah. Well, I've seen a number of different types of situations, and in the non-Catholic evangelical southern types of religions, I've seen just the kind of opposite type of thing that might happen, in that they're certainly not interested in the scientific details of things, and I often see a very literal translation of the Bible, and it's kind of used as a shield to keep them from interacting, or keep them from learning, or keep them from trying to be involved. It's almost a fatalistic type of thing. If this is happening, this must be God's will. Or types of things like the Bible tells us we should have dominion over the earth. Does that mean we just exploit it and take all the resources we want? It's not a view of we are part of this earth, okay? And I also get this question quite often that infuriates me, and then I settle down and I answer it the best I can, which is still insulting. What good is this? Like, what good is that little fish anyway, right? Well, turn it around. What good are you? Really, what are you really doing for this earth that little fish isn't doing? It's surviving. It's living from day to day, and it's doing its own little thing in living in connection with all the rest of the abiotic and biotic factors here. And so that, like, it implies that fish has to have a purpose to you and me. It doesn't. It's living its own life, hopefully unimpacted by you and me, but it's not able to do that many times. But that mentality, I don't know how to get rid of it. And it's a lot. It comes to this idea that we're the most important thing on this earth, and I really don't believe that. But I think in a religious structure, it is focused on people. It is more of a social type of thing, and it still kind of gets lost somehow in that, the biological reality that we are living with all these things, and we're not the most important thing versus are we the most important thing, and can we do or should we do whatever we can and whatever we want. Somehow that has to reach a balance, and I don't know how to get there.
I just wanted to talk briefly about the latter question, which is one of the reasons I was excited to be here and share these thoughts with this community, is that I think we're in a phase where we're going to have persistent uncertainty in science, where we're not going to be able to resolve things in the manner of confidence that we used to. And so that leaves a vacuum for things like values and for other disciplines that should now be invited to participate in a more rigorous manner. It doesn't mean that we dismiss what we know. It just means that we fill that void with something different. And in my experience, when you bring in those other disciplines and perspectives, you create a sense of humility that is really needed, where people can start to revisit, well, am I overconfident in my findings here, or am I overconfident in what my field scale technology testing indicates? And that's really helpful, I think. So that would be my assertion, is that we have this persistent uncertainty. We're not used to dealing with it, and we need to bring in other perspectives to fill that in a clear and equitable way.
And I see that Jerry is pacing, so I believe that he would like to close this session. Thank you. Thank the speakers.
Thank you, everyone. That was a wonderful session. This afternoon, we have another science paper from a colleague from University of San Diego, and we have two plenary presentations, one from our speaker from the University of Notre Dame on religion and ethics combined, and we also have a kind of theological, ethical review of much of what we've been discussing already with one of the Duquesne University faculty. So we're going to have a break for lunch. A good hour to digest food properly. We have a wonderful buffet outside, so please just go out in your own time and bring your buffet back to your tables here. Or you can eat through there if you want, whatever is more convenient. There's more space here probably. We'll gather again in an hour. In the meantime, to our global live streaming audience, enjoy your evening dinner, because you're probably a little ahead of us. For the Asia components, you might be about to get to your bed, and so if that's the case, good night and enjoy. It's been lovely having you participate in live streaming. I would also say that we are, through the live streaming, videotaping everything for people to be able to access afterwards. Okay, enjoy lunch. Thank you.